Can I just first thank you so much for coming here tonight. Tim, you've given me a very big job to do, to somehow compress into just over an hour the more than 20 hours of taped conversations I had with Harold in the preparation of the book. But just before I say anything else, I just want to say how moving it is to be here, because the last time I was at an evening event in the St. Patrick's Centre was on the occasion of the launch of my dear friend and much missed John Killen's book about St. Patrick in 2018, and we think of John and we think of Marion and their family. Harold, I just wonder, did St. Patrick feature very much in your upbringing in Derry as the son of a minister, a Methodist minister in Derry?
I think it's true to say that in general, prods weren't really into St. Patrick in the way that our neighbours and friends would have been. He was never, I mean, he was not disrespected by any means. And there were lots of examples of where his name was, there are lots of Protestant churches with the name of St. Patrick, including St. Patrick's Cathedral. And so, I mean, it wasn't that he wasn't honoured, but there wasn't the same fuss made of him that there would have been. But I do remember my father, who was also a Methodist minister, and he was in Enniskillen at the time. He obviously thought that the good people of Enniskillen, the good Methodists of Enniskillen...
And there are good people in Enniskillen, that's where I was born.
Yeah, so I hear. He thought it's time that they learned a bit more about St. Patrick. So he announced on Sunday, next Sunday, I will be preaching on the life of St. Patrick. And on Saturday night, somebody went into the study and they saw him struggling with a number of books, and he was trying to make a sermon on the life of St. Patrick, and he said to his young assistant minister at the time, he said, "Wish I'd never heard of the man." Wasn't because he didn't respect him, but he was finding it difficult to put his life into a sermon for a 20-minute sermon or whatever it was. But I'm going to go on to say something very positive. That was positive because he obviously respected and honoured the man. But this year there will be a repeat of what was attempted last year, only they're going to even do it better this year. There will be a St. Patrick's Day celebration on the Shankill Road. A big event, you know, they're going to do it, really taking it very seriously. It's a group of loyalists that I'm involved in working with, trying to help towards transition. And this is one of the things that they themselves want to do and are planning, and it will be a great event. So just remember that we're trying to make up for maybe our indifference in the past, and hopefully it'll go well.
And I think your father would welcome that. Tell me about how you became a Methodist minister in the sense that, was it inevitable that you would follow your father's footsteps into the ministry?
No, I think it was in spite of. No, it was just something that I chose for myself. There was never anybody suggested to me that I should or expected it of me, but it was something that I felt I was attracted to the whole idea of ministry, and I'd had maybe a good role model, but I was also influenced by some books that I read about ministry, particularly about a minister called Lax, L-A-X, of Poplar, which has been made very famous through the Call the Midwife. And Lax was the minister in that area, and I remember reading his life story and stories of his ministry, and I thought, if it could be that much fun, who would want to miss out on it? And I've never regretted that decision.
And looking back, though, your father, how do you think he and your mother influenced you in terms of your formation into the person that you have become, the ecumenist, the peacemaker, the peace builder?
Yes, I was fortunate in that I had parents. I was going to say it was a mixed marriage, because my father was from County Cork and my mother was from County Armagh. And they'd come from two very different kind of backgrounds. And that was good. It was healthy because we grew up with an understanding of life here and life in the other part of Ireland. I was just talking to somebody before we came in who was recently in Kilkenny and spent many of my boyhood holidays in Kilkenny. And so we had a love for and an understanding of life right across the island of Ireland because of my parents being from West Cork and from Armagh.
And of course your wife from Waterford.
And then just to complete the confusion, I married a young lady from Waterford who's sitting over here in the front row, Clodagh. I've never felt myself to be a part of this part of Ireland or that part of Ireland. To me, Ireland is my home.
Yeah, but I remember you telling me that your father, he was a man before his time in terms of ecumenism, in terms of reaching out, and indeed he had a friendship with a local Catholic priest on the golf course.
Yes, he was very, very open to all of that. I mean, he would have just had no part at all in sectarianism. He would have welcomed opportunities to have friendship with anybody, whatever tradition, and be it with a priest on the golf course or and when we would go on our holidays, spent a lot of them in Kilkee in County Clare. Mm-hmm. And I remember we would go into the Roman Catholic Church and he would help us to understand in what way it was different and in a respectful understanding. So I grew up with that kind of broader understanding of church and of life on Ireland.
But you also had a very interesting ancestral hinterland too. Tell me about your two grandfathers.
Yeah.
One grandfather, Peter Good, from West Cork, an RIC man, and the other grandfather, grandfather Isaac Allen from County Armagh, and a member of the old UVF.
Yeah, I always say we carry the DNA of those who have gone before us, and we are probably unconsciously more than consciously influenced by what we've inherited. Peter Good, my grandfather, was from near Skibbereen in County Cork. He was in the old RIC, and he refused to take part in the evictions of the late 19th century. And as a result, he was disciplined. And in the police...
For refusing to evict his Catholic neighbours, essentially.
Yes, yeah, he absolutely refused to do that. And I'd often heard, that he was disciplined for this, but actually somebody introduced me to the records in Brooklyn, where the PSNI headquarters now, and they have all the records of all the men who served in the RIC, and there is Peter Good's record, and there is the record of him being disciplined for refusing to obey orders, and he was quite heavily fined financially, and not long after that he left the RIC. He had 10 children to support. And so I have great respect for him. He died before I was born, but he was obviously a man of great principle. The other grandfather, Isaac, to whom you referred, was the land steward in the Ardgrey. Have you been to the Ardgrey, that lovely National Trust estate? And he was the land steward, and my mother was born in the land steward's house. And she remembers the night when she and her sister were told to stay in their room, and if they heard anything, ask no questions. Don't come out of your room and ask no questions. And it was only afterwards that she and her sister realised that the footsteps they heard that night going up to the roof space were those of my grandfather and his neighbours who were returning from Larne, having picked up their carload of weapons from Colonel Crawford. They were...
The Larne gun running.
The gun running of 1914.
Fighting Home Rule. Yeah.
Fighting Home Rule, prepared to fight the British to stay British. Mm-hmm. If that isn't Irish, finish our way, So he was a man, very principled person, and, you have to look back to the context of those days, to understand how this good living man was prepared with his neighbours to take arms. So if I'm confused, you can understand because of, the DNA.
And then, Harold, tell us a bit, you mentioned there about holidays in the Republic. And in fact, that gave you an insight into life in the Republic that would certainly have contrasted with the popular view among many Unionists in the North. Can you tell us about that, about the opinions that you formed of the Republic of Ireland on holiday in the South, in the 40s, in the 50s?
Yeah. Well, we just accepted that there was a difference in the different parts of Ireland. We to go on our holidays. My father had to get a thing called a triptych. Do you remember the triptychs? Yeah. A little triangular thing that you stuck on your windshield. And so you were aware that, and then you would be either coming or going, particularly if you were coming back, they would be checking to make sure you hadn't any contraband. And we used to, I'm sure we smuggled a few things. I remember one time buying a shirt in Dundalk and hoping that they wouldn't take the shirt off me, off my back, quite literally. But, I was aware that there was different, but it wasn't a big deal, There was we never had any anxiety about going across the border. And, to us it was a lovely place to go. You got, particularly post-war, when we started going down, you got ice cream, which we didn't have in the North. And you got chocolate biscuits and all sorts of things. So everything it was like the land flowing with ice cream and chocolate biscuits down there. So there were a lot of advantages that they had that we weren't aware of up where we lived. But there was no big deal about, being in a foreign, hostile place or anything like that. Not at all. It was just another part of our life experience, and our family happened to live in different places.
Yes, and
so that was good from our point of view, because it meant I didn't grow up with any of those fears or prejudices, which were quite common amongst other people with whom we would have. I can remember when Claude and I went to the Shankill Road, where we were our first appointment back here. I remember somebody coming, Claude, you remember somebody coming to you and saying, "Mrs. Good, we were down where you come from." And they were all very nice to us. And we went to church on Sunday morning and nobody interfered with us. There were people here who grew up with that kind of suspicion.
And another thing that you had, Harold, was by virtue of that very interesting ancestral background, was that the events, the very violent events in Ireland around the partition of Ireland, the War of Independence, the Civil War, they impacted actually on your family. And of course, your family were a very prominent Methodist family in the south of Ireland, and indeed an uncle of yours actually around the time of the Civil War, he did business with the local leader of the IRA in Waterford, isn't that right?
Be careful who you tell that to. Although I have recorded it in the book, I have even got a copy of the billhead.
Yes.
Where he provided Commandant Whelan with a considerable number of shoes, socks, shoelaces and belts amongst other things. My uncle and aunt had a business in Dungarvan in County Waterford, and this was just during the Civil War. And obviously, we only had the billhead as the evidence of the transaction, and it was quite a considerable sum of money. I've forgotten it. It was, you know, in today's terms,
something like £4,000 in
about
today's money.
£4,000 in today's money. So Commandant Whelan, who was quite a guy in the IRA, must have come to the shop probably after hours and gave an order for so many pairs of boots and shoes and belts and shoelaces and you name it to equip. Now, what was my uncle to do? He would not have had any sympathy with the IRA, none whatever. But had he refused to serve them, would he have been in business the next day or the next week? I doubt it. So he never spoke about it, but we found the billheads much later, even after he had gone.
And another intriguing story, and I'm drawing out some of these because, you know, there's far more in this book than the big headlines about Harold revealing details of the secret talks between himself and Martin McGuinness and Geoffrey Donaldson that paved the way for the restoration of devolution in 2005. There's so much more in the book. And tell us, Harold, about how the Civil War and Civil War impacted actually on Clodagh's family.
Yes, well, that's another story.
Yes. And De Valera, anyway, was a man not to be mentioned actually in polite company.
That's right, yes. When I went to Waterford, that was my first appointment after ordination, and I was told if I visited the family of the Code family, I could talk about anybody or anything, but don't mention De Valera. And that was because at the time of the treaty, the conflict between the treaty and the anti-treaty people, De Valera and Collins, Clodagh's grandfather, who had a business at the centre of Waterford, they came to him and said, sign this, you know, the anti-treaty petition. And he said, look, I'm a businessman. I'm not interested in the politics, and I just sell boots and shoes. And they said, well, until you sign that, no one will cross the threshold of your business until you sign that. And he refused to sign it. So they put a picket on the door to make sure nobody entered the business. After the pickets had gone home and under the cover of dark, the story is that notes would be left at the house from the local convent or the Christian Brothers. We need 6 pairs of size 4 and 5 pairs of size 6 or whatever. And Clodagh's father, who was a young fellow at the time, would go in and collect whatever the order was, and they would deliver them under the cover of dark to the various institutions and schools and convents. But then one night they came out and set fire to her grandfather's hay barn. He had a farm outside of the city, and indeed it was while trying to put out the flames with a bucket chain that he took a serious heart attack from which he never recovered. And Clodagh's dad was only a lad at the time, and he had to leave school because his father was no longer able to carry on the farm work, etc. And so that's why you can talk about anybody, but don't ever mention De Valera. He was the villain in the story.
And you obviously actually stuck to that advice not to mention De Valera.
Oh, I would never have been given his daughter in marriage.
Indeed, and that brings us very, very nicely to your marriage. Was it in 1964? And then, Harold, after a short spell as a minister down in Waterford, indeed, where you met Troda, you head for America.
Yeah.
And I suppose I have to ask you, given the times that we're living through, what do you make of Trump? And we'll come to how your experience in America impacted and informed your preparations for ministry in the north of Ireland when you came back. But what do you make of Trump today, given your very deep interest in America going back so many years?
Yeah, I knew little or nothing about American politics at that time, but we went out to America on the old SS America, and it was in the mid-60s, 64, and Lyndon B. Johnson, just shortly after Kennedy had been assassinated,
Yes.
and Lyndon B. Johnson was standing for re-election, and he was, I'm trying to remember my memory for names, who was his competitor, help me out, who was, no.
He was his running mate, was he not?
No, this was a person who was running against him. No. No.
I think it was Goldwater, Barry Goldwater.
No, it'll come to me. Anyway, he was the Trump of his day. And people on the boat were saying, I knew nothing about American politics, but I overheard these conversations, people saying, if it was Barry Goldwater, you're right, it was Barry Goldwater. If he gets in, we're going to leave America. And people were saying this, and I thought that's very strange. Anybody would leave their country on the basis of who happened to be elected. But when I got to America and I began to understand a bit more about American politics and about this man Goldwater, I understood why they would say that they didn't want to be living under his presidency. And he really was a forerunner of Trump. Only maybe not quite as excessive as Trump is in some of his policies and his behavior. And so I learned very quickly. I'd never really taken much interest in Irish politics, but I did find myself, you couldn't avoid taking an interest in what was happening in America in the mid-60s, the whole civil rights struggle, the whole, and we were living there in a very, very divided society. And I began to understand when I heard people talk about racism. I thought, now where have I heard that kind of language before? And I realized how racism and sectarianism were two sides of the same coin. And that was a very, very big learning moment in our lives. And there were many stories that we brought back from that.
And one of those stories that I found so intriguing and was such a surprise to me, when it emerged in our conversations in the writing of the book, was here you were ministering to a black community in Ohio, was it?
Indiana.
In Indiana. At the time of the assassination of Martin Luther King. So can you maybe just tell us about that and the challenge that the assassination of Martin Luther King posed for you in pastoral terms?
Yeah. I was studying for a master's at the time, and I was asked if I would do a little bit of part-time care of a congregation that was without a pastor at the time. And I said yes, happily. And it turned out to be an almost exclusively black congregation right down in the center of Indianapolis. When I say exclusively, there was one white lady, elderly white lady, and she said, nobody's going to move me from my church. And she was like the queen mother in that congregation. They just adored her, and she was lovely. But the congregation in its totality otherwise was black. And they were so warm in their welcome of us. I remember when I was asked, I said, look, you know, am I the right person to invite me to minister to this black congregation?
And to preach to them on the Sunday, a few days after the assassination.
Well, that came shortly after. But I remember saying to the district superintendent, like I said, you know, I said, I'm Irish. I'm neither black nor white. And he said, no, you're green. And I said, in more senses than one. But they were wonderful. They gave us such a warm welcome, and we had a little toddler at the time, and they just loved her. And they were, anyhow, very shortly afterwards, it wasn't there very long until Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I said to the elders of the congregation, look, there must be somebody who will take worship next Sunday who can resonate with your feelings and your hurt and your pain. And they said, no, Reverend, you're our pastor. You pastor us through this. And I will never forget that Sunday morning. And I've often said, say it again, those people taught me more about the meaning of the word grace than any book I've ever read on grace. The way in which they came to terms. You had to be there with them in the middle of that to understand what that moment meant to them. It wasn't just the death of their hero. It was the death of their hopes and their dreams and their aspirations, all of that. And they had to try and cope with that. It wasn't just the assassination of somebody to whom they looked. It was more than that. And they gave me the enormous privilege of sharing that with me and entrusting me with the task of helping them through that experience.
And that was in April 1968.
Yeah.
Indeed, just a matter of months before the birth, before the first civil rights demonstrations here in Northern Ireland. And then, of course, you returned home very soon after that. Would have been
August.
August 1968. And you found yourself really returning to a very different Northern Ireland, didn't you? And the place changed very much before your eyes, and you found yourself ministering in the Shankill Road in Belfast.
Yeah, we came home with a 5-year plan. We had 2 little girls born to us when we were out in the States. We thought we should share them with our parents, and we thought we'll come home, and it had been a very busy time, and we thought, I'd like a nice, quiet appointment. What about... And I knew that Clough-Jordan was going to be looking for a new minister that year.
Way down in the
Midlands. I said word through my friends, look, if nobody else is anxious to go to Clough-Jordan, I'm your man. And, a long way to Tipperary. And I thought that would just be nice. And Clodagh would be able to be closer to her family. And the word came back and said, no, you're not going to Tipperary. You're going to the Shankill Road in Belfast. This is 1968. That was where we found ourselves. And it was quite a contrast from Tipperary, what we'd anticipated, because we were just...
And yet, in a way, the events of Derry in Derry on the 5th of October 1968, when you had the water cannon used by the RUC against the civil rights demonstrations, that actually was, in a sense, prefigured by an experience that you had as a boy preacher of maybe 19, 20 years of age in Newry, when you were essentially a trainee minister in Bessbrook. This was a few years before, several years before you left for America. Tell me about that experience, because you have described it as one of the defining moments of your life.
Anybody here from Bessbrook? Part of my, what we call probationary years, which is a student minister, and I was in Bestbrook, in the village of Bestbrook, and I had some responsibility for a church out in the country on the Banbridge side of Newry. So I was coming home late one evening. Now, there was a curfew, and you weren't supposed to be out after 10 o'clock at night.
Under the Special Powers Act.
Special Powers Act.
At the time of the IRA border campaign.
But I had a certificate which allowed me to be out after hours for the purpose of attending to my duties. And I was coming back from having been out visiting some of the homes in this rural community. And, about
early 58, we think, about 10 years before the outbreak of the civil rights movement.
Right, and it was the border campaign, as they called it, was on the border, Fermanagh border, and then the County Down, Louth border, all around there. So I was coming home, and I heard tremendous commotion from somewhere at the centre of Newry, and I went round. My little moped, and I went round to Margaret Square in the centre of Newry, and there were, I don't know, maybe 100 people or more sitting down in protest against the curfew. And the old RUC were there with a water cannon, and they were hosing these people out of the square. And I thought, that is the most awful thing I'd ever witnessed, to see people in their own community being hosed out. It's what you did with vermin, treating people like vermin. And it wasn't that the people were violent, it was a sit-down protest, the protest against a curfew, which was a legitimate protest. And I really hadn't taken note, particularly of the politics of the day, but all I knew was there's something wrong about that. That is, the next day people were saying, that'll cool them down. And I thought, no, I don't know what phrase I used, but it was something like pouring petrol on the fire, as indeed it was, because that was the beginning of much more dreadful, fearful days and nights, not just there, but as the years went on, and we know how that escalated into something much more. Yeah,
you described that as a defining moment.
Defining moment.
And there had been an earlier defining moment as well, when as a 16-year-old you encountered Ian Paisley for the first time, or observed Ian Paisley for the first time, and this would have been in the autumn of 1953.
Yeah, I was only a schoolboy, and I and some of my friends had gone to hear, anybody remember, or you may be familiar with Youth for Christ, which was an evangelical movement for young people, and we'd been down in the centre of Belfast for one of these rallies of young people, and nearby, Blitz Square you're all far too young to remember all this, Blitz Square in High Street in Belfast, where Mr. Hitler had ravaged the centre of Belfast, and there was this big barren area where people would have political meetings or religious meetings or protest meetings or whatever they wanted. It was kind of the Hyde Park of Belfast. And I was down nearby when I saw from the direction of the Albert Clock a procession of people being led by a very tall figure in a black coat and black hat, and there was a little flute band playing as they walked along, and I remember thinking, this is like Custer's Last Stand that I'd read about in my boy's own annual. But it was not Custer, it was Ian Paisley in the very early days of his more public life that we became more familiar with. And he was leading this little group of faithful followers and this band to Blitz Square. and there was one of these watchman's braziers burning, and a soapbox. And he stood up on the soapbox, and he had a book in his hand, and it was a book written by Professor Davy, who had been the principal of the Presbyterian Theological College. And he had written what today would just be thought of as speculative theology. Nobody'd be batting an eyelid about it. And he was just saying, we need to, examine our faith more carefully and be, and there was something about the virgin birth that he was reading. And I was only a teenager, and I didn't really understand much about birth, let alone the mysteries of the Immaculate Conception. And but he obviously had studied it and was not impressed by Professor Davies' speculations. And he took the book, and he would read a paragraph, and then he would tear out the page, and he would drop it into the fire, and he would lead the little group of people around him in a robust singing of "We have heard a joyful sound, Jesus saves." And then he'd read another bit out, and he would tear out that page and drop it in. And then they would sing the next verse of "We have heard a joyful sound." And I thought to myself, I don't know what that's about. But I was thinking of ministry. And I could take you to the corner where I stood, and I said, Lord, if you want me to be a minister, please don't let it be anything like that. I don't know what that's about. But please, because I just sensed it was something like I had read about in the deep south of America, the burning of crosses and the Ku Klux Klan. To me, it was reminiscent of all of that. And that was my first sighting of Ian Paisley, and it was chilling for me as a schoolboy. In the book, if you don't mind me,
Please do.
I'll turn over the pages because of a chapter on Ian Paisley as I came to know him. And I described that as my first sighting of Paisley. But then I end up by telling how after he retired, or after he was retired from both his party and from his church, I went to see him. I had some conversations with him over a period of time, and that's another story. But this was at the end, and I went to see him, and I brought him a gift of a book, and to thank him for having had the courage to take us to a new place, as he did, together with my friend Martin McGuinness. And I went to thank him, and we talked. And I asked him about I remember asking him how I said, Ian, there was a time when I said to you, I'd like you to meet Martin McGuinness, and if you do, you and he might get on better than you think. Well, he said, I remember one morning we come into this office, he said, and I said, Deputy, we're going to have a hard day's work ahead of us. It'll take us a lot of prayer to get through today. And he said to me, well, why don't we pray? And we did. I thought, Blitz Square, High Street. Now, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness having a prayer meeting in Stormont, And I thought, kind of amazing grace came into my head. And he and we prayed together before I left that room for each other, for Northern Ireland, for our world. And I gave him my book a book I had brought, and he gave me a copy of his book that he had written about the 59 revival. And that was my last conversation with him. But Blitz Square, the room in Stormont, amazing.
What a journey. And another huge figure in our recent history who also embarked upon a very consequential journey was Martin McGuinness. And one of the most remarkable aspects of the book is how you relate your regard for Martin McGuinness, how he became a close friend, a confidant. And I suppose, just tell us if you'd like to, about the occasion when you met him for the first time in Derry. This was just a couple of weeks after the breakdown of the IRA ceasefire in February 1996. And I remember you telling me that for quite some time prior to that, in Methodist circles, and maybe in other circles too that you were picking up, there was a sense, oh, this man, Martin McGuinness, he's somebody we need to engage with. He's somebody we need to get to know and talk to. So can you share some of that with us?
Yes, we had within the Methodist Church, we had what's called the Council on Social Responsibility. And we had begun to talk with people both in loyalism and in republicanism who we knew to be people of influence, and we'd had conversations with these folks. And then after Canary, well, the leadership of the more obvious leadership of more public leadership of republicanism came to us and said, can you do something for us? Please, can you persuade the British establishment to give a public recognition of our ceasefire? What they wanted really was a photograph of Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams on the steps of Downing Street to reassure their dissidents and their doubters that they were being taken seriously. I know Chris McCabe is somewhere here in the audience tonight, and Chris, you'll know all of what we're talking about. And the establishment were not ready for that. And then we had what we knew, what we'd been told would happen if something didn't change. We had the Canary Wharf bomb, tragic event, because it was the death of a person, but it was also the death of hopes and aspirations. So we felt we need to intensify our negotiations, our conversations. And we said, Martin McGuinness obviously is the key person in all of this. So we made an appointment to see him, and I remember going with a few others up to a little room in the Bogside where he had an office. And we met him. And one of our party, David Gallagher, had prepared 10 questions or 10 points that we wanted to impress upon Martin McGuinness. And I can remember how seriously he took us. He had an A4 pad, and he wrote down everything that we were saying. And he responded, very thoughtfully to each of the 10 points that we had brought to him. We left saying, this wasn't just, a performance. We left saying, we really do think he means business. There was just something about the engagement that was very serious. And that was the beginning of a very serious relationship that became a very personal relationship as it progressed.
Mm-hmm. And then, Harold, just fast forward then maybe a decade or so, and you find yourself bringing together Martin McGuinness and Jeffrey Donaldson into your home for very important conversations. Now, I suppose, had anyone suggested a year, 5 years, 10 years before that this might take place, they would have said, look, these people need their head examined. Yet this happened in the privacy of your home. Tell us about their first meeting, and tell us a bit about how they got on. And of course we know that resulted in paving the way for Paisley and McGuinness going into government.
Well, I had been approached by somebody from on high and asked if there's any way I could use because I had already made this overture to Martin McGuinness and had established some kind of a conversation and a relationship. And also I had, going back in some time, I'd had some conversations with Jeffrey Donaldson. And I sensed that if we could just get those two people in a room to begin a conversation, that if they weren't able to take something forward themselves, they might at least give some suggestions as to who and how we might progress the conversation. And it was very clear after the first, I invited them to meet each other in our home. And they came, and I realized after that first meeting that they were two people who could do business and do business with each other, given time and space. And again, it all had to be under the radar. You know, there are some journalists who've been a bit cross with me more recently because, you know, they didn't know what was going on, and they accused me of being, you know, breaking confidences in report. You know, but if we had let them know, if that become public, that would have scuttled it. It would never have got off the ground. But they came, and they came back, and they came back again. And in fact, I've taken some notes in my diary of how I would get a phone call maybe at 3 o'clock. Do you think we could get together at 4:30? And ring up and say, I have to come back. Yes, maybe could you leave it till nearer 5? This kind of notation I have in my diary, and it was just lots of coming together like that. And those two persons, they took the opportunity very seriously, and they did very important business at our kitchen table. And that's where best business is done, really.
And of course, you had already established your bona fides in the eyes of many, many, many people by being the person entrusted to co-witness with Father Alec Reid the decommissioning, the destruction of IRA arms. Why do you think you were the person who was asked? I know you were sort of very cheerfully engaging in the speculation as to who these clergy witnesses might be, but you were the one who was approached. Why do you think that was?
You need to ask somebody else, really, because I'm not sure. Except, you know, my first bringing Martin McGuinness and Jeffrey Donaldson together was prior to the decommissioning. Yes. They'd already established this connection. Suppose they both knew me and trusted me, and all I can think of is that just there was trust. There was trust. Very precious thing is trust, and you have to cherish trust. And I think it was that we had a trusting relationship, so that whoever it was who got together say, well, who shall we send and who will go for us? That maybe those two people had some. But you very
much were a person who didn't engage in finger pointing and in condemnation, I suppose. And I know that your outreach extended not just to Republicans, but to loyalists as well. Isn't that something very particular to Methodism, that you really have an extremely inclusive approach based on what's known as the alls of Methodism? Isn't that right?
Well, I suppose, yes, there's a theological kind of base to our approach to church and community. Our founder, John Wesley, if you go up to the grove here behind this building, you'll see a plaque where John Wesley preached to I don't know how many hundreds of people here in the Grove and Downpatrick.
He visited Downpatrick 4 times, last time in 1789.
Yeah, and the plaque is up there. You're very knowledgeable. But he was a person who reached out beyond the establishment. He was a person who was concerned with the sort of the excluded people in society. And the mantra of Methodism was to be the friends of all and the enemies of none. Mm. We've tried to live up to that now. We haven't always lived up to it as well as we should. But that's the sort of tradition, and the sort of the distinctive teaching of Methodism is within what is called the Four Alls, which is about all people. It's for everybody and everything. So we've been nurtured in that kind of more all-embracing, rather than inclusive rather than exclusive understanding of faith and community. And he was probably an ecumenist well before the word was even thought of, where he was saying to his Catholic friends, if your heart be as my heart, give me your hand. That was one of the...
He actually wrote a letter to Roman Catholics.
And that's in that letter he's saying, if your heart be as my heart, give me thine hand. And so that was the tradition. Now, we wouldn't want to for a moment suggest that we were better or more enlightened than other people of other traditions and other faiths. But I suppose because we are a minority ourselves, we have an understanding of what it may be for people who feel themselves to be excluded and to be minorities of another kind. And so, and we probably have a less, our structures are such that we're more flexible. For instance, our little think group that went out to meet people and build bridges, we didn't have to go back and get permission every time we wanted to go and see somebody or say something, which was very important. And we had that sort of trust and freedom, and that gave us, and I do remember going to some meetings with others, and there was this kind of approach, if only you would do this, and I remember the last of those meetings I went to, I said, I'm not going back to that because I saw it taking us nowhere.
You're not mentioning who those church leaders were?
No.
But you thought that was really counterproductive?
Totally counterproductive. We had to learn that wasn't going to take us any further. It might make us feel good. It makes you feel very good to be able to say, if only you two, come on. But it doesn't take us anywhere.
And you saying that resonates very much with, I remember Father Des Wilson. He used to ask the question, where did condemnation get us? And I know that, of course, he was the person who took you to Bombay Street, I think, after the burning of Bombay Street in 1969.
That's right.
But maybe we'll move on, and there's so much we could talk about, but I think we must talk...
Maybe supper time.
Well, let's talk about...
If not bedtime.
Let's talk about the Queen. Let's talk about your luncheon appointment with the late Queen Elizabeth II, and how you ended up in Buckingham Palace, and indeed the Queen asking you for some advice about a future visit to Ireland.
Yeah, don't ask me how I ended up at her lunch table, but I got an invitation to come and have lunch with her, and two or three things stand out about that. I remember I was very privileged. I got sitting on her left-hand side for, an hour and a half. And that's scary, an hour and a half, having her almost to yourself. And people would say, well, that must be bad. I said, well, actually, the scariest thing was it was so relaxed. You could have said the wrong thing so easily. It was a bit like having lunch with your granny. It was she was so lovely and so personable. But I remember the first thing I said, ma'am, the last time you and I met was in the centre of Belfast. We met at the Belfast Central Mission, the Methodist Mission in the centre of Belfast. Yes, she said, that was just round the corner from that hotel the most bombed hotel. You're, you know, to all the places that she goes, to be able to remember that. Anyway, we had a lovely conversation, and she asked me, she said, it has been suggested to me, this was about 4 years before the Irish was, she said, it has been suggested to me that I should consider a visit to Dublin. What do you think? And I said, wonderful, wonderful, and I encouraged her. I'm not suggesting for a moment that that was why she came, but it hopefully reinforced what she had been told by others, that the time had come. Anyway, we had a lovely conversation, and then I learned quite a bit about the protocol in the palace. You know, it's the corgis who decide when the time has come for the meal to end, because at a particular moment the corgis came from under the table and just looked up at her. And if you want to know what she keeps in her handbag, or kept in her handbag, dog biscuits. And I said, ma'am, your doggies have privileges that my doggie isn't allowed. And she said, well, you notice they didn't come begging, did they? And I so much wanted to say, well, one wouldn't, would one? I thought that might be off to the tar, so I resisted that. But then there was a lovely moment. Do you want me to go on and talk about...
Well, I was going to ask you then, I can't ask you about the Queen without asking you about your conversation with the Duke of Edinburgh over the coffee afterwards, because you had to put him right on something regarding the nature of Methodism, hadn't you?
Oh, yeah. Those who...
A brave man.
Well, those of us who had been sitting next to herself, we then went into the drawing room, and we were to have coffee with himself, while those who had been on the other side of the table with him went to have coffee with herself. So we found ourselves, 3 or 4 of us, with the Duke, and he looked at us and he said, I don't suppose you eat like that every day. You know? And we looked at each other and looked, and nobody knew what to say. And I just thought he probably meant it's more lunch than we would normally have, which was true. We wouldn't normally have a 4-course lunch, certainly of that standard. So I said, well, no, I said, and nobody knew. And of course, we, as ministers and priests, we're supposed to watch out for people who don't know what to say, so you have to fill that gap, you see. So I said, no, we don't eat. I said, no, we don't eat like it every day. I said, but we did enjoy it, and we don't feel at all guilty. He said, you don't feel guilty? That's interesting coming from you. And I said, oh, come on, I said. It's only those Puritans who feel guilty when they're enjoying themselves. And I said, you know, those miserable Puritans. Oh, he said, aren't Methodists Puritans? Oh, I said, no, we're not Puritans. No. We're the joyful people. I said, you know, I said, and I suddenly thought to myself, good, what are you at? You're having this theological debate with the Queen's husband in her drawing room. That's very impertinent of you. But, you know, the atmosphere was so kind of, you know, so I find myself saying, you know, I sometimes see you at great state occasions singing one of Charles Wesley's great hymns, Joy of Heaven to Earth Come Down. And I said, I see you singing that. That's who we are, joyful people. Oh, he said, I thought you were the miserable people. I thought you were like those Puritans. I said, no, come on. I said, just you remember that. Joy of heaven, that's who we are. He says, oh.
Not many can say that they put Prince Philip in his box.
Oh, yes. But then, yes, and somebody else beside me said, yes, I agree with, and they said, touched me as I agree with them. And he and I lifted our coffee cups to each other, kind of game, set, and match.
Well, Harold, here we are what is it, 27 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and 20 years after decommissioning. And where do you think we are at as a community?
Well, aren't we at a very different place? Aren't we? I got cross with my daughter recently. Don't tell her I'm telling you this, but I got cross. She said, "Dad, you know, there's nothing for young people here now." I said, "What do you mean?" Well, she said, when they go into town, they can't get, the last bus goes at 11:30. They can't get a bus after 11:30. And I said, "Don't you forget, when you were their age, you would never have thought of going into Belfast, let alone getting a bus home." Life has changed. You know, our grandchildren wouldn't have an idea what life was like back in those days. Isn't that great? They don't have an idea what life was like. We're in a very different place, very different place. Now, that doesn't mean we have completed our journey, of course not. We're still on a journey towards...
And you call it an unfinished journey.
It's an unfinished journey. It's an unfinished journey. And we're learning as we go. We are learning as we go. And sometimes learning as you go can be painful. It can be a bit, one back and two forward, and then another one back. And there's a bit of that. But gosh, and we do know. Now we have I think we have some difficult conversations that we still have. I remember being invited by Sinn Féin into what they called an uncomfortable conversation. And the uncomfortable conversation was about the future of this island. And it was a good conversation, but actually it kind of became a bit too uncomfortable for some. So the conversation got kind of parked for a while and has been parked. But I think it's a conversation that is still waiting. We have to have this conversation. And as from the unionist Protestant perspective, we shouldn't be afraid of having this conversation. Are we going to wait till events overtake us? Do we learn something from Brexit? I think we should. And we do need, if we care about this place we call home, this island we call home, we need to care deeply together about the future of this island. And because we all have something to bring to that conversation, and we need to hear each other in that conversation. And I'm trying to help some of my friends from within the Republican nationalist side of the community. Please try and understand the fear on the unionist side of the community, the Protestant union side of the community. Understand our fear. And part of that is based on history, part of it's based on prejudice, part of it's, but let's understand that. And we have to listen to you about your, history, the part that history plays in your story. We need to hear that. And we can only hear each other if we sit with an open mind and an open heart and talk about the future of this.
So you don't have a predetermined outcome, do you? Or like Wallace Thompson, do you think that a United Ireland of some kind may be coming into view?
I think the future is going to be different from what
or
everybody
a new
would,
Ireland.
But whatever the future is, it'll be different from what people might wish or long for or hope for. That doesn't mean it'll be. I think it'll be better than what people might think of. But we need to start to think about that and plan about that, and rather than pretend that there's no tomorrow.
But you don't have any predetermined outcome?
No, my only desire would be that whatever the future shape, I'll be very content with it as long as it's an agreed an agreed Ireland. Was that John Hume's mantra? An agreed Ireland. That's what I have no, if you were to ask me, what, I remember reading about the Covenant way back, where my grandfather took arms to in protest and signed the Covenant and all of that. At that time, there was a Presbyterian minister called J.B. Armour in Ballymoney, and he drafted an alternative covenant. And his vision was of an Ireland in which we would all have a part to play, and that the Protestant Unionist community had something distinctive to bring to that. But his alternative covenant never saw beyond one rally that he called. But if we were to begin to think like that, what each of us has to bring, each particular tradition has to bring to the whole, would not be a better way of thinking rather than, I don't want whatever it is you have to bring.
And in terms of the role of the churches, as we contend with the legacy of the past and contend with the uncertain constitutional future, what do you think of the churches? Do they not seem rather quiet at the moment?
In terms of?
Making their resources available perhaps to facilitate the ongoing and necessary conversation about legacy and about contending with the past.
You have two things. One is legacy, which is dealing with the past, and the other is the conversation about the future. And sometimes those two get very confused, and I think that's part of our difficulty. That we feel that we just get those two conversations colliding rather than looking at them separately, because they are separate. They are related but separate. Legacy is something that we could talk about all night. As you know, it's a very controversial issue at the moment, and there is the Legacy Act, which the present government has promised to reform and amend, and that's work in progress. We'll see what comes of all of that. But it's dealing with our past, dealing with the hurt and the pain of the past. And I believe that within the faith community, across our churches or our denominations, we ought to have something distinctive to bring to that conversation. And I have a chapter at the end, it's the epilogue in my book, where I'm talking about what is it that we have to bring to the table to talk about how we deal with legacy and how we deal with the past. And I'm saying out of our tradition and out of our vocabulary, there are three words. The first one is confession or acknowledgement, honesty, about what we have done and what we have failed to do, which has contributed to the hurt and the pain of the past. And we need to be honest with each other rather than being defensive. We need to say, well, here's what I have to bring to that conversation. The second word is that word that I used earlier, grace, which is another word for generosity, where we need to have a generous spirit when we come into a conversation about the past or the future. And the third word that I emphasize that comes out of our vocabulary of faith is the word forgiveness. And that's a very difficult word. That is the most difficult of those three words. And what do we mean by forgiveness? And I try to unpack a bit in that. I end up by saying the only people really who can help us to understand what is forgiveness are those who have forgiven or those who have been forgiven. And we put some wonderful examples in our community of people who have forgiven and who have been forgiven. and we must learn from them. So that's how I think we have a contribution to bring to that conversation about legacy and about the past. About the future, I believe we should be a part of that conversation about our future rather than waiting to be overtaken by political and other events.
And in a way, given that the churches are all Ireland churches, does that not actually make them better qualified, if you like, to facilitate?
Not only better qualified, but I think it means that they should have a special responsibility. Because if we have responsibility, as we do in the four main churches, for right across this island, we are the Methodist Church in Ireland, Presbyterian Church in Ireland, the Church of Ireland, the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland. I mean, we don't have a border, there's no partition in our church governance. And therefore, we not only have a special responsibility, but I think we should have a special care of and responsibility for what happens to the future of this island. Not in terms of political boundaries or whatever, but in terms of the values that we want to make sure are at the heart of governance and at the heart of our community. Those fundamental values which are at the core of our shared faith, that we should be the guardians and protectors of those values, and let somebody else decide about the political boundaries.
And all that, of course, means talking, it means dialogue, and you make a point in the book of stressing that talking does not mean capitulation, but in the eyes of many people, once you actually sit down to talk, you are perhaps actually signing up for an outcome that you can't or do not wish to live with.
Yeah.
How can you assure people, you know, that that to talk is not capitulation and is not actually doing your own side down?
I think the only way you can persuade people is to invite them into those conversations. If you're not a part of those conversations, then you stand back and you're fearful of them. But again, you see, when I think of Martin McGuinness and Jeffrey Donaldson at my kitchen table, I can remember the first meeting they had. It was very cool, very, you know, you felt, you know, you needed to bring in the hairdryer to, it's a cool, you know, but it wasn't long before they began to realise that they could be honest with each other about their own thoughts and ideas without surrendering. And one then came to understand the position of the other. And I'm involved, have been involved, and it's in the public domain, with the parading issue up in North Belfast. And for the last number of years, we've had the residents from the nationalist community and the Orange sitting on either side of the table. And I think of the first meeting we had and where we are now. And it's all about relationships. Statements are important. And we've had lots of statements from political leaders, from church leaders, and it's all very good to have the right statements. But nothing takes the place of people getting into a relationship and conversations that are based on relationship and trust, mutual trust and respect. And that can only happen when people, I always say that tea making is an important part of peacemaking, because you bring people. I remember one time saying something about that. I said, you know, I get embarrassed when people introduce me on a platform as this great peacemaker. I sometimes say, actually, my role is that of a tea maker. And one of my sons, cheeky lad, he said, Dad, come off it. You didn't make the tea. Mum made the tea, you just poured it. But you know what I'm saying is that at a table, and a kitchen table preferably, where did our Lord have some of his most important conversations as we read the Gospels? It was at a table where he met with people and had conversations that are timeless.
And maybe just at this juncture, we might like to invite anyone in the audience who might like to ask Harold a question. Anyone sort of... yes, a lady
There are
here.
people still out there. We can't see you, you
Yes,
see.
it's very difficult, but...
There are still people there, believe it or not.
Yes, several people have their hands up.
About those that are making the tea, but did she ever get involved in the conversations?
Who's that?
Did you joked about those that are
Oh,
making
yes.
the tea, but did she ever get involved in the conversations with Mark?
Not during the, she certainly had a lot to say afterwards. No, I think, Clodagh, you used to take yourself off after having served your scones, your now famous scones, and left the tea for me to pour. Maybe you're saying that there should have been a female voice in those conversations. And that might have been helpful. But,
And Father Alec Reid, didn't he make the point many times, and especially when you were with Tony Blair in the United States, that women have a particular contribution, a particular charism in peacemaking?
Oh, yes. I mean, Father Alec, dear friend, and he had 5 points. We were asked to speak. We never got beyond the third one because he and I could both talk plenty, but we never got beyond his third one because the time always ran out. But the third one was the importance of the female perspective. He was very, very emphatic about that, and he would always say, he would kind of apologize for his church not giving women the place that he thought they should have. And yeah, that was very important. So does that answer your question to some extent?
Margaret?
Yes.
Yes, Harold, you and I met back in 2007.
We did.
Over a fairly contentious issue.
We did.
Whenever I was minister in the Department for Social Development.
We did.
And I remember that particular executive whenever Ian and Martin were the first and deputy first ministers. So they must have been doing a lot of praying, because it took us a long time, some days, on a Thursday afternoon before executive meetings actually began. And some of us were left in the wilderness, and we used to wonder what was going on. We understood it was the lack of that precious commodity agreement. But you mentioned, obviously, some 27 years ago was the Good Friday Agreement, but there was one missing ingredient, and Hume said that now the healing process must begin. And really, we're still waiting for that healing process to begin in a very real way, by being more inclusive, by communities coming together. How do you see that evolving?
Yeah. This is where I think, and we should, within the faith community, we should be less hesitant to contribute what I think we have to bring to it, which is something of what I was saying earlier about bringing those distinctive gifts, which is about honesty and grace and forgiveness. But we need to be careful how we interpret those words within a very hurting and wounded community. I think we need to think a lot more about how we do that, and it has to go beyond producing pamphlets and making statements. I think we need to find a way of engaging with each other We've been listening listening to the news the last few days from Oma. The hurt and the pain and the grief that we're hearing, we've forgotten. But those people haven't forgotten. They've been living with it. I heard some of them speaking today and saying every day they're still living, not just with the physical wounds, but with the pain, the spiritual pain, the emotional pain, and the mental strain. Now, how do we engage with each other to help to understand each other's pain? To really hear each other. I think, how do we do this? As I ask the question, I really am asking it not just of myself, but of our churches and of our community. Can we move beyond the blame game? We're still in the blame game. Listening to that debate about the football pitch in Derry. Come on. You listen to that, and then you listen to the stories from Oma. What are we playing at? We need to begin to get into each other's stories, the real stories. And I think that's where healing would begin. I remember at Coromila meeting a young man who was from Germany, and he was on his way from Germany to Jerusalem, Berlin to Jerusalem. And I said, well, what's that about? Well, he said, I am going through every European country that was hurt during the World War to apologize and ask for the forgiveness for my people, what we did to your people. And he wasn't even born during the Second World War. And he was walking from Berlin to Jerusalem, asking forgiveness for what his people had done to other people.
Just wondering, anyone else?
Do we ever think of crossing the street? Do you ever think, and what about in the corridors of power? If people would cross the corridors of power just reach out to each other, across the churches, my church to your church. I, who have not suffered physically, we must all know some family or somebody who has suffered. That's where it could begin. And maybe move out from that. Margaret, I haven't really answered your question very well.
I think because I have been reflecting the whole legacy debate, having participated in the debate on the various stages of the Legacy Act, and now we're in the next stage because the current government is going to repeal policy 18, which deals with inquests and inquiries and all that sort of thing. But it's simply dealing with words and legislation, but it's not dealing with how we bring people together and how we listen to what they have to say. And that is missing from the debate.
That's right. That's what I was trying to say, that it's people crossing whatever the boundary, the street or the corridor or whatever it is, to do.
I saw a gentleman at the back in the centre.
Good evening. It's a great conversation. I was wondering whether, given your juxtaposed racism as sectarianism, whether there was a place for what they did in South Africa under Bishop Tutu for the truth and reconciliation type approach.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be learned from that process, but not to be imitated. I think that they themselves, I spent yesterday with a man called Rolf Maher, who was a part of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who's visiting Ireland at the moment. And I think he would be the first to say, yes, we would be happy to share with you some of the things we have learned from our experience. but you'll have to create your own way of doing it. But there are those who would say that was a good start, but it hasn't really resolved all the issues in South Africa. But there are things we could learn from that. But I think the principle, the basic principle, a bit like what Margaret is saying there, that we must find a way of reaching out to each other in honesty. And I think at the center of the TRC, there was this emphasis on being honest with each other about what we have done to each other. And I think that's a very important lesson to be brought from that. I remember reading about a group of people who arrived at the office of the TRC at the last minute before the closing date for making submissions. And they were asked, why have you come? And these were mostly young people. And they were asked, what is it you're asking for? And they said, we want to confess to our silence. Our silence. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of confession for silence that might be required. I remember another defining moment in my own journey was way back in the 70s when things were really rough. The Reverend Eric Gallagher, who was our superintendent of our Methodist community within Belfast, brought us together to think about what we might do within this increasingly volatile and dangerous situation. And at the end of it, there was one minister called Wilfred Stafford, long retired. And I remember him standing and saying, may I say something? And Eric Gallagher said, of course you may. He said, I just want to say to these young ministers, please, 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 don't come to my stage in life when you have to live with your regret for what you did not say and what you did not do. And I remember that very clearly. Not to come to the end of our working life and have to live with what you failed to say, what you failed to do. And that was a very defining moment, one of the many defining moments in my ministry. And I learned from him this elderly minister, now retired, who said he had to live with this regret. Now, what can we do? I think each one of us has something we could maybe contribute to what Margaret's just been saying. How do we bring some healing to our own community? None of us are going to be able to go out and change the world, but we could change the relationships within our own street, within our own community, within our own congregation, within the neighbouring congregations, and that would be a start.
And I think that it's very fitting to end on those very profound words of Wilfred Stafford. And thank you so much, Harold, for coming along this evening and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you.